Different jobs here always leads to some of those jobs interrupting with some of the other jobs. So my apologies to you. It's my dream at some point in my life to just have one job. That'll be nice. So today we're kind of continuing on with our early modern tour. And we're going to be looking at England today. Then we're going to, if we have time, the question, just as a reminder, remember your 600-word reflection is due Thursday. That's 2 days from now. And everyone should have a prompt for that. It's been posted not once but twice on Classroom, so if you don't have that, it's there. Remember your test is February 20th. That's the Wednesday after we come back from the President's Weekend. So I would recommend start reviewing if you have opportunity and chance for that. And then we're going to be talking, so we're going to be looking today at why England evolved into a constitutional monarchy. You know, France becomes an absolute monarchy and Spain becomes an absolute monarchy, but why does England become something else? Of course, that idea is very important to us in this country since as an English colony, we ended up developing constitutional government. Then today and tomorrow and Thursday rather, we're going to be looking at Baroque art, which was kind of one of the key artistic movements of the early modern period, and why it tended to support and flourish in absolutist states, where there were absolute monarchies. Then we're going to be looking at how Spain developed in the early modern period. And finally, we're going to be looking at why witchcraft persecution peaked in the early modern period. Because you look at all of these things and you see, well, if we're becoming more and more reasonable as a society, why are we persecuting more and more witches? I mean, like in our country, during this time period, you had the highest persecution of witches, the Salem witch trials during the early modern period. You had Protestants and Catholics equally. In fact, Catholics have a bad rap with the Spanish Inquisition, but actually Protestants persecuted witches at a much higher rate than even Catholics did in Europe. So, but why did both groups suddenly come out of the woodwork looking to persecute witches? So we're going to look at all of those things during the early modern period as we finish this up. Then, after we test, we're going to be moving into the Enlightenment, which is going to give us the scientific revolution, the French Revolution, and capitalism, and the American Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. Gives us lots of revolutions. Enlightenment's a really big deal. It also gives us my homeboy, John Locke. Okay, so all pumped about those things. So that's kind of where we're going. Today we're going to be taking a look at England, though. Why did England become a representative government? I'm going to give you kind of a brief tour. Now, one of the things that you want to make sure that you do as you're looking at this, I'm just giving you some highlights here. I just walking around the room, sometimes I see that some of you still aren't really doing alphanumeric, or at least a form of alphanumeric, but you're just kind of writing things down in a block. Alphanumeric makes things a whole lot easier. Why? Let's like outline form, or a form of an outline. Why does that make things easier? You know the sequence, what goes with what, what's interrelated. So if you haven't done that yet, I would really encourage you to. I know kind of here at Farmington High School, we really push the Chromebooks, and you need to do interactive computer stuff, and that's cool and everything. But I will tell you that as you go to your four-year universities, hardly any of it's going to be that way. Almost all of your professors are going to be lecturing. Lab, obviously you'll do lab. If it's a small seminar group, you'll discuss literature. But otherwise, it's going to be a big lecture hall. And one of the things you're going to have to become good at is following along with a conventional lecture. And many of you are well on that way. So let's take a look at early modern England. And this is going to be England basically from 1509 or 1500 all the way until 1688. That's what we're going to be taking a tour of today. Now, Henry VIII, we've talked about a little bit before. Henry VIII, of course, is known for what? What things? What is he known for, Hannah? Okay? Can you help us out there, Bridget?
Many wives.
He had many wives. He had 5 wives. Okay? Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, all of those kinds of things. That's true. Okay? What else was he known for, Shelby?
Wanting a son.
Wanting a son, yes. Wanting a son. And that one of a son led to what, Mr. Hatch?
The Protestant Reformation of England.
Yes, the English Protestant Reformation. And he founds the Church of England. Okay? With the Act of Supremacy in 1534. So that's very important. Okay, so he basically converts England into Protestantism, largely because the many wives and his want of a son, as you said, Shelby. So that's important. Henry is significant for that reason. He's going to break England from the Catholic Church, and he is going to then make England Protestant. How does he get other other Catholics in England to go along with it? Some he persecutes, but how does he, like Thomas More?
He sells the property of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, he bribes them, very good, Bridget, with the property of the Catholic Church. So let's see how Catholic you really are. So will Lady Maria go along with it and convert to Protestantism if Lady Maria gets a farm or a monastery or gold or silver that the church had had? Well, and so he's able to, so one of the things that he does is he destroys all of the Catholic land, seizes all of the Catholic territory, strips the altar of gold and silver, and smashes all the monasteries. If you go to the UK today, if you go to England today, you will notice that there are a lot of former monasteries, there are a lot of Catholic churches that are just shells. They're what we call ruins, particularly if there were stone buildings. And that's because Henry sacked them, took all of the wealth, gave it to his allies. Okay, well, he dies. And the next guy who comes to the throne is Edward VI. That is his only son. Now, there is a problem with his son. His son is young, he's a teenager, and he's very sick. He's a sickly young boy. And he is, basically controlled for the most part during his reign, since he's a teenager, by some advisors who are very strongly Protestant. But since he's a teenager, most teenagers do not have what? Well, they don't have common sense. And what else do they not have?
Money.
I was going to say money.
They don't have leadership. He had money since he was king. They don't have sons.
Oh, yeah.
They don't have heirs. So he got sick. He dies. His reign is 6 years. He dies in 1553, and he has no son. He has no daughter either. He has no kid. No.
How old is
He was a teenager. When he died, he would have been about your age, Hannah.
Oh, well,
So
I have so many kids.
you do have so many
I know
kids.
what his problem is.
Yeah. Already you've got 5 or 6.
I do. They're doing well.
They're doing well. Well, give them my best.
I will.
Okay? 21, I think, is your oldest one, right?
Yeah, you're right. Gretchen, she's doing great.
It's a lovely name. All right. So, Edward VI dies. He has no heir. And who's going to come to the throne? Well, if you remember, what had put Henry VIII's dad on the throne was the War of the Roses, in which there had been no heir, if you remember that. So they would be like, oh, we want to avoid a civil war at all costs. So they put Henry's oldest daughter on the throne. And that is Mary. Now, the thing about Mary, okay, is that she was the daughter, she was the first child of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, if you remember, where was Catherine of Aragon from? You might say, well, Aragon, but that is in Spain. Yes. So, Mary was raised religiously as what? Since mom was what? Raised as Catholic. Very good. Raised as a Catholic. So she was Catholic. When she comes to the throne, what does she temporarily change England back to? Catholicism. So now, Lady Maria has to give her lands back to the Catholic Church. How do you feel, Lady Maria, about that?
Not happy.
Not happy. And she starts persecuting some of the Protestants. Hence her nickname is what? Bloody Mary.
Oh,
Okay?
is that where the drink came from?
Yes. Her nickname is Bloody Mary. And a lot of the Protestant noblemen, and even the Protestant middle class, are like, man, we can't have this. She's trying to take our land. She's persecuting us. She wants us to go back to be Catholic. So they don't like her on that. They don't like her for one other piece, too. And this is the other thing that they don't like about her. She is dating the King of Spain. She is dating the King of Spain, Philip. They are cousins.
That's fine.
But hey, that's all right. They're,
When we were in Chelsea the other day, I accidentally made a joke.
And one of the guys turns around and goes,
Well, at least I'm not from Farmington. And then he like ran away.
I mean, he also has a point.
Yeah. They didn't give us a standing ovation because they all hate
We were like the only people that didn't get one.
aww.
No, Liz texted me.
Everyone
Liz
said
texted me and
everyone
she goes,
sits.
But they
But
didn't
North County
stand for
did.
North County either, so we were okay.
North County
What was the king's name?
I hadn't realized until the year I worked at MAC how much we were hated in the NAAA.
Yeah.
Everyone despises Farmington.
No.
Yeah,
Are we?
Sometimes we, okay, our students actually when they turn around because of the other team,
Yeah, I know.
I'm like,
pretty sure every single
Yeah. Does Perryville do it? Okay. Okay.
Perryville does it.
we're not the only ones
Okay.
that are fine.
But anyway, it's just, yeah.
Yeah.
You just get more funding because you have more tax money.
Yeah, that's probably it. Yeah, no, I don't know. Maybe it's because we have a Sonic. Who knows? That's why they hate us.
I feel like that puts us down.
Puts us down, okay.
Our kills are Sonic.
That's true. All right. So Mary is dating Philip, who is King of Spain. Now, yes, they're cousins, but that's not the big deal. Here's the thing. If they would get married, what does that mean? It not only means an alliance, but if she gets married, who's going to be the King of England? The King of Spain, which means that England is just going to be in the future like a province of Spain. So you got the religion deal, and then you've got basically the idea that England is going to be grafted onto Spain, because frankly, during her lifetime, Spain was the more powerful nation. And so a lot of the English nobles were like, we can't let this happen. We certainly can't have them be, we can't have Spain be, annexing us. So ultimately, they overthrow, the English nobles overthrow, imprison, and ultimately execute Mary. And put a teenage girl who's about 16 in power. This is the second daughter and last living child of Henry VIII. Remember when we talked about Henry VIII getting Anne Boleyn pregnant? Well, Elizabeth I was the bun in the proverbial Anne Boleyn oven. Okay? And so she was raised Protestant. Her mom was Anne Boleyn, although she didn't get to be around her very often because what did Henry do to Anne?
He killed her, but in a
Killed
nice
her,
way.
but in a nice way. Okay? So Elizabeth, of course, is going to ascend to the throne. And frankly, to everyone's surprise, largely because society was incredibly sexist at this point, she became arguably the greatest monarch in English history.
She's
Her-
16 years old.
Yeah, 16 when she came to the throne, and she stayed there until she died in 1603. Okay? So she was there a long time. What were some of the achievements of her reign? Well, one of the key achievements of her reign was she defeated the Spanish Armada. We talked about that, I think, already in 1588, but she had also had a dalliance with the King of Spain, but she had no intention of ever marrying him. In fact, her nickname was the Virgin Queen. Why did she want to be the Virgin Queen? She knew if she married, what would happen?
She'd lose her power.
She'd lose her power. So she would string along different suitors, including the King of Spain, but never actually married them. She encouraged privateers, which we would call pirates, like Sir Francis Drake, to go out and raid Spanish galleons. Spain, of course, had the New World and all of the gold and the silver from that New World. Okay? And they had big, big, heavy ships called galleons. That's spelled interestingly close to gallon, but they're galleons, and would ship them over. However, English pirates, privateers like Sir Francis Drake, would raid them. And Elizabeth more or less encouraged them and didn't stop them at all. Ultimately, Spain is going to send its armada, its big navy, to invade England, and ultimately they are defeated in part by a hurricane. And the Spanish armada or navy is no more. And who replaces Spain as having the #1 navy in Europe? England. And that's going to be the backbone for England's military for the next 300 plus years. Now, what else happens during Elizabeth's reign? Well, Elizabeth is the monarch who starts to encourage English settlement in North America. Let me give you an example. What colony was Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Patrick Henry all from? Virginia, which is basically a version of the Virgin Queen, named for her. Okay? So, she's going to encourage New World settlement. Okay? And so that's going to be important for us and Native Americans, because the United States basically is the basis of those English colonies. And for Native Americans, well, we killed them, for the most part, by disease and other means. And one of the great genocides in world history is basically this. Historians estimate that there were approximately 10 million Native people in North America. By a century after that, they're looking at 800,000.
We are just.
So, I mean, if you compare this, obviously the English and Europeans didn't build, factories of death like Nazi Germany did. A lot of this is through disease. But if you look at just sheer death with genocide, you had roughly 9.2 million people dying in 100 years of contact.
Oh my goodness.
It's a lot of death. We always talk about how the Holocaust is so terrible. And by no means am I saying the 20th century Holocaust is not terrible. But 6 million Jews died in that. 9 total, with the awfulness that Hitler did. And you look at this New World settlement, and you're seeing 9.2 million Indians pass away. Okay, so Elizabeth does all of these things. The other thing that's important about Elizabeth is this is kind of the peak of the English Renaissance. Because who was working at the Globe Theater during her reign? Shakespeare. Okay? So, like the flowering of English plays and literature takes place during her reign. Okay? Now, there is kind of a little problem with Elizabeth, and can you guess what that problem is? She doesn't have any heirs. So, who's going to succeed her? She makes an arrangement that James, who is the King of Scotland, will come to the throne. James was the daughter, or son, Freudian slip there, but that's another story for another class. James I was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a cousin of Elizabeth.
So like her second cousin.
Yeah, James was her second cousin. Now, what kind of made this a little awkward is that Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth had some political conflicts, and ultimately, Elizabeth had Mary, Queen of Scots, executed.
Oh,
There's a
lovely.
show about this.
Yes.
I forgot what it's called, but I remember watching it. He was the
It's
Prince
called
of
Ring, never mind. It's easy.
He was the Prince of Scotland.
So ultimately, James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England in 1603. Now you might say, well, why is this important? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, remember on your map quiz, Edinburgh was one of the key towns of Scotland, key cities of Scotland. By making James king, what are you unifying for the first time? Scotland and England. So basically the British Isle, the main isle, is going to be unified by him being king. Now there's formally going to be the Act of Union about 100 years later, but this literally consolidates the rule, okay? It's pretty important, okay? What else is important about this? Well, James I and his mom, there'd always been whispers that they were kind of closet Catholics, and to prove his Protestant bona fides, guess what he did? He paid to have a team of scholars translate the Bible into common English. And that version of the Bible in English became known as the King James Version of the Bible. And it was profoundly influential in English Christianity. My grandmother swore to me that that was the original version of the Bible. And I was like, no, Grandma, this was done in the 1600s by King James. No, this is the words that Jesus spoke. And I'm like, it's in red letter. And I'm like, no, Grandma. Those are the English translations of the Aramaic words that he spoke. This can't be. No, Brian. You've gone to college. You don't understand these things. I'm like, I guess I don't. Sorry, Grandma. Rest your soul. So James is important in that regard. And then James dies.
Does he have any?
Yes, he does have an heir. And that heir is Charles I. Now, I will tell you that we call this era of rule the Tudor-Stuart era. Okay? Because the Tudors were Henry VII through Elizabeth I. And then their cousins come to the throne, and they're Stuarts. S-T-U-A-R-Ts. And James I is the first Stuart. Charles I is looking at what's going on across the English Channel in France. And what's happening across the Channel in England during his rule, in France during his rule? What is France becoming more and more of? It's becoming a more absolute monarchy, right? They are saying divine right, king's got all the power, you know, Louis the 17th has got all the power, this is how it should be. Well, Charles I has a French wife, and he's like, I want it to be like this. I want power. I want to be an absolute king. There's only one problem that England had. You may remember from last semester, or you may not, you may have had a brain dump, that's okay. But in 1215, what...
The Magna Carta.
Yes, Abby. 1215, King John had to sign the Magna Carta. And Abby, what was the Magna Carta?
I don't remember, but I just know it was.
Okay, yeah, it basically, Bridget, limited, it was the granddaddy of all constitutions in the English-speaking world. And King John had to sign it when the barons or council of nobles came up and said, sign this, buddy, you've been raising our taxes. And if you remember, who had the power of the purse in the Magna Carta beginning in 1215, the power to raise taxes? A council of nobles which evolved into Parliament, which is the representative branch. And so over 400 years from the time of 1215 to the time of James I, Parliament developed. And Parliament became not just nobles, but it was a bicameral legislative branch. Bicameral meaning two houses, right? And what were those two houses? The House of Lords, and who could sit in the House of Lords? Lords, nobles. And the House of Commons.
People.
Common people, people who weren't noble, and they were elected. That was the people's house, and the Lords was the noble's house. And so Parliament was becoming increasingly powerful. And if you remember, when we talked about the 100 Years' War, in which England was basically fighting in France to take over France. What were the English kings doing most of that time in the 1300s and 1400s? Fighting overseas. And if you're going to fight a foreign war, what do you got to have?
Money.
You got to have money. And so who's got to grant that money? Parliament, right? Parliament. Now, Parliament's going to say, I want more power in return to give you money to fight your wars. So over this time, Parliament, from 1215 to about the time of Charles I in the 1600s, it's becoming more and more and more and more powerful. And Charles doesn't like it. Charles decides, I'm not going to cooperate with this. Over in France, they're not dealing with this. Over in Spain, they're not dealing with this. The king can do whatever he wants to do. And so Charles says, I'm not going to call it Parliament. They can be seated, but I'm not going to call them into session. And there is a Parliament towards the end of his reign that, believe it or not, is called the Long or the Rump Parliament. Now, what is your rump?
Your butt.
Yes, your buttocks, as Forrest Gump would say. You know? Yes. And the reason they called it the Rump Parliament is they were seated in Parliament, but they were not called into session for years.
So they were always sitting on that.
Yes, that's so. And Parliament was just like, no, we want this. We have a constitutional right. Charles, you're not doing this. Charles, you're doing the wrong thing. And there was a religious faction that was growing up in England in Parliament during this time, called the Puritans. Now, some of you may be in Intro to Lit, and may have read early American literature about the Puritans. Some of you maybe weren't. The Puritans were English Calvinists. You know them best as some of them were pilgrims who came to the New World. They were kind of like Puritans on crack. They were like, we need to be super religious, and the ones in England aren't religious enough. But the Puritans generally didn't like the Church of England because it wasn't Protestant enough. They saw it as having too many trappings of Catholicism. Book of Common Prayer, and organ music, and priests and robes, and they just didn't think it was quite strict enough. And ultimately what's going to happen, and the Puritans tended to be from the middle class. They ultimately are in Parliament are going to have such a conflict, and they are led by a dude by the name of Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell is going to lead, and there's a nice picture of the Lord Protector, that's the title he will take for himself, the leader of the Puritans. Cromwell is going to lead the English Civil War. And in 1642, the war begins. And the English war has got two sides. The Cavaliers and the Roundheads. Now, what were Cavaliers? Well, they are in Cleveland. They are LeBron. They have no king, though. These Cavaliers had a king. Yeah, they supported Charles I. So it was so much better when LeBron was there, because then it was like Cavaliers king, King James. But now he blew it all with free agency and left to Cleveland yet again. Sad day for Cleveland. All right, so Oliver Cromwell and the Puritan forces are the Roundheads. Why are they called Roundheads? Because what do they want no one to wear? A crown. So if they're not wearing a crown, what are they opposed to? Monarchy. Cavaliers support the king. Well, what ends up happening in 1647, Charles I is captured. And what do the Puritans and the Roundheads do? Remove themselves of the king. How do they remove themselves of the king? They kill him. They commit regicide. They kill the king. They chop off his head. And from 1649 to 1660, there is something called the interregnum. 1649 to 1660, it's called the interregnum. And what that means is the rule between the kings, literally in Latin.